I went to see Dr. Bucci, my guidance counselor, for the first time, and I said, I need to apply to college. Um, what do I do? And he pulled my transcript out of his file and he looked at it and he went, ugh, I don't have time for the smart ones. Go back to class. You will figure it out. And that was it. That was the sum of my college counseling at that public high school in Connecticut.
Mallory, do you know what my favorite ever Christmas gift is that you gave me?
I don't, but I think you're going to tell me.
Yes, it's that book of quotes from Karl Lagerfeld.
Yes. Oh, I just thought it was a pretty coffee table book. I'm glad you actually looked at it.
Oh, it's wonderful, and it's chock full of all these amazing quotes. And the reason I thought about it is that I wrote down every other phrase that Lee said during the course of this episode, and I thought, that's advice not just for admissions, but for real life as well.
The interview we are about to get into is so good, but well, do you want to know what my favorite gift from you
Oh,
was?
tell me.
I was leaving M Stoner. You commissioned a special cocktail for me. It was called the Hard Goodbye, and I actually just this past weekend made a round of hard goodbyes for me and my husband. We drink this drink all the time, and so I think of you every time I shake the shaker.
I still have the bottle of mezcal that I bought specifically for that event.
Mine was gone many years ago.
I'm just in denial, Mallory. I never really said goodbye. But speaking of the opposite of goodbye, we can say hello to Lee Coffin today. He is the Vice President of Admissions and Financial Aid at Dartmouth. He's had a distinguished 31-year career as a dean in higher education. Lee has served as Chief Enrollment Officer and Institutional Champion for Access and Affordability across 4 highly selective institutions. His tenure includes Dean of Admissions at Tufts and Connecticut College, and honestly, Lee's influence shapes the national conversation on higher education. He's the chair of the Ivy League's Admissions Committee, and he works on the College Board Enrollment Leadership Group. He is a proud first-generation college student who went on to teach at Harvard Graduate School of Education. He is also, coincidentally, the creator and host of a super popular weekly podcast, The Admissions Beat.
You will hear in this conversation with Lee is the influence that being a first-generation student had on him. I think about our sponsor, On Deck Marketing, who is helping students like Lee, like myself, find their right fit institutions by increasing the visibility of those schools to those students long before they ever maybe intentionally start their college search. And we know that visibility isn't a campaign, it's a long-term play. It lives in the counselor networks, it lives in the school hallways, it lives in the church communities, the transfer pathways, and the ways that the students encounter your institution, or they don't, long before they search. You can have a real impact on that. So I highly recommend everyone goes to On Deck Marketing, mktg.com, checks On Deck out. But with that, let's get into our conversation with Lee.
Let's go. Lee, I am so thrilled. Thank you for saying yes to us.
Oh, of course. Why would I say no? Yeah, no one's ever used the word icon in association with me, so I'm flattered. Thank you.
Well, you are one of the icons, and I remember when you and I first met to talk about that Tufts graduate school project, and I just learned about you and learned about the institution, and I was completely in awe of everything that you were doing. So when we came up with a series, honestly, you were one of the first few people. We're like, okay, we have to have Lee. If he says yes, we have to have him on the show as soon as possible. So
here I am.
here you are.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want us to start off by talking about your background, because I firmly believe that our personal experience shapes the way that we show up to the work that we do.
Yep.
So you came up through admissions. You were at Connecticut College, Milton Academy, then Tufts. You were also, from what I understand, the first person in your family to go to college.
Right.
And so I want to talk a little bit, or have you talk a little bit about how that experience as a first gen student shaped your approach
Yep.
and your philosophy about who should have access to a place like Dartmouth.
Yep. No, it's a really important question, and it's the first question I ask every admission officer applicant is to give me a 2 to 3 minute autobiography to see both what they share, but also what I'm listening for is the voice someone will bring into the admission committee. Because when we recruit, when we read files, when we're in committee making someone's case, you inextricably pull from your own story as you represent someone else. And my goal as dean is to make sure the team in around me has a lot of different points of view so that when we're meeting lots of different people, someone in the room can be like, okay, I get that. And so for my story is somebody who grew up in a middle class suburban town in Connecticut. I went to a public high school with a horrific student to guidance counselor ratio. And, the origin story of Lee as an admission officer happened in my senior fall when I went to see Dr. Bucci, my guidance counselor, for the first time. And I said, I need to apply to college. What do I do? And he pulled my transcript out of his file and he looked at it and he went, ugh, I don't have time for the smart ones. Go back to class. You will figure it out. And that was it. That was the sum of my college counseling at that public high school in Connecticut. And, this was 1980. So pre-internet, pre-guidebook, pre any infrastructure as we currently know it. And I relied on my mailbox. So I had taken the PSAT and the mail started to flow and I would bring it upstairs to my bedroom and sort it out. And I read everything. I was that weirdo who actually read everything that someone sent me. And places resonated. And then I started to extrapolate off of that to find the places that felt like they fit. But I remember that story as a really important part of the way we do our work in college admission. We can't assume everybody knows how to get from A to B. And there are a lot of high achieving students from under-resourced schools, from under-resourced communities and families, from backgrounds where nobody's going to college, and this journey we're on is not always known to the people on that path. And so, how does being first gen influence me? That's how it is. I can repeatedly step back and say, how do I translate what I'm doing to an audience or to a family like my dad and my mom who didn't fully understand how to help their smart kid go to college. I always knew I would. I don't know how that came to be, but it invites me as an admission officer and as a dean to remember that there's a lot of families that are very well oriented towards particularly selective college admission. There's a bigger universe that doesn't have a clue about where to begin. And then I would say part two of that is when I'm reading files, same thing, like bringing that poetry to the task, knowing how to read between the lines and say, she hasn't said X, but it's here in the file, and it's my job as the admission officer with a first-gen background to represent her fully, and perhaps in a way that she didn't know how to represent herself.
Yeah, that is. Let me ask a quick follow-up. I mean, you basically had to figure out the journey yourself. Your guidance counselor set you free and said, "You'll figure it out."
He
Great.
handed me an application to the University of Connecticut, which was my state school, and he said, fill this out, you'll be fine. And I went home and told my mom that, and mom had worked for a little bit as a secretary before I was born, and she was making dinner, and she said, I don't see you at the University of Connecticut. And I don't know what made her say that, but she pushed me to expand my options. So that was one of those moments of serendipity, and I've reminded her that. She said, "Yeah, I don't know why I said that." But I use serendipity as the word, and the serendipity of my story was I had to stay after school to take a chemistry exam, and the chem teacher lived down the street from me, so she gave me a ride home. And as we were driving home, she asked about college, and I said, "Yeah, I don't really know what I'm doing." Told her the story I shared with you, and she said, "My husband is a guidance counselor in the next town. Why don't you come over after dinner with your dad and have him look at your records?" And I did that, and he looked at my transcript and my extracurriculars, and he said, "You should be looking at really selective places." And he gave me a list and said, "Go find information and start to explore." And that's how liberal arts colleges got on my list. Dr. Bucci infamously looked at the list afterwards and struck a bunch of places off the list and said, "Too far away. You don't need to be looking at that place. Stay in state." So, for me, my whole college search was framed by this person who didn't really know a lot, but disrupted my journey in ways I don't think he was intending to, but he just was pointing me in a really particular way. I was lucky that my neighbor was a guidance counselor and was able to introduce places to me that I'd never heard of.
Yeah, yeah. Did you end up at a place that was like far afield from what you originally planned?
So I originally started my search in a very first gen way. I was very pre-professional in the way I was thinking about college. And my father was kind of in my ear saying, you have to study something that was practical that will get you a job. So I started looking at journalism schools because I was the editor of the student newspaper, and that I enjoyed it, and it felt like, okay, journalism. So I was looking at BU and Syracuse and places with undergraduate programs in journalism. And as I was exploring that, the neighbor said, "No, you should be looking at the New England liberal arts colleges and Yale," which was not far away, but I had never thought about even considering Yale. And the liberal arts entered my story that way. And as I learned more, I realized I didn't have the appetite for pre-professional. I wasn't really sure I wanted to be a journalist. It was just what I knew. And the liberal arts started to dance across my stage, and I said, "That sounds interesting." And there I went. And I ended up going to Trinity. And I was one of the only people in my senior class who went to certainly a private institution, and one of the few that went to a liberal arts institution. And that was hard because it felt uncharted, and I did it.
That is so cool.
Yeah, but it gets to the work. When I met Yuval, we were working on a communications project, and it speaks to the importance of storytelling, and how do you use the multiple platforms we have now to introduce the idea of college, how to apply to college, how do you afford college to this contemporary audience that's so much more heterogeneous than it was when I first started doing this, and even when I was a high school student.
Wow.
Lee, let's talk about Tufts for a minute,
Yeah.
because you showed up in 2003, and the
Uh-huh.
school was fine.
Yep.
But then by 2016, it was one of the most selective institutions in the country, the kind of school that a smart kid, maybe your younger self, would have wanted to go to. And I think a lot of that comes and traces back to bets that you made on voice. And you've actually already introduced this idea of voice in this conversation by talking about how you interview your admission counselors. But, something that you implemented at Tufts was you had students write short stories, draw an ad for a product that doesn't exist, imagine history bending a different way. And you called that thing cutting through the qualified muddle.
Yeah.
So walk me through the bet.
Yeah.
What were you chasing that grades and scores were missing?
Well, I don't think the grades and scores were missing so much as, when I talk to high school juniors about their college search, I say there are two fundamental blocks of information that each student shares by way of introduction. There's data and there's voice. So the data is foundational. The grades and scores for the places that require scores help the college answer a fundamental question. Can this student do the work in the curriculum we offer, however we deliver it and whatever pace? So in my Dartmouth example, we're on a quarter system. We have a 10-week term. Students take 3 courses at a time, often in small classes. So when I'm looking at a transcript, the data is part of the answer to the question, has this student followed a curriculum in high school that prepares them for this fast-paced, interactive, small, immersive experience? I have. If I were at a bigger place, I might not ask that same set of data questions. So, but then the good news, bad news about the data is most of the students in the pools where I have worked are broadly qualified. And so you can't use data alone to define who gets in and who does not. And so as you're shaping community and filling the class with the who, that's where the voice comes in. And when I was recruited at Tufts, the former president, Larry Bacow, who went on to become the Harvard president, said to me, this is a fine university caught in the middle of liberal arts colleges and universities, and we need to find our voice, the institutional voice. How do we talk about what we do here in a way that's distinct to us, that doesn't apologize for not being a larger university or a large liberal arts college? Like, we are where we are in this middle lane. And so part of what I started doing there as we were building that community and trying redefining campus culture accordingly was to use the voice part of the recipe to say, who are the best fits? Like, tell me your story in your own words, and to give prompts on the application that invite storytelling and to make it individualized. And to me, that individualization is the magic ingredient that helps the admission officer and then broadly the committee and the dean understand, yes, Jack and Sue are the two out of this qualified muddle. And what I mean by qualified muddle is the pool is broadly qualified and they're all jammed up. And so I think most people, when they look in the window at a selective college admission process, think about data, full stop. Their GPA, their testing. If you go to a high school guidance office, most of them have some kind of scattergram now, which plots an outcome on that grid. But the grid doesn't show a 3D version of the person. The grid in that high school guidance office is showing this little star who got admitted at that GPA and at that testing intersection was a poet who was also the leader of our community service group, who was also someone who wanted to major in religion and philosophy. And all of those things made that 3.97 GPA twinned with a test score whole. And that narrative is what moved that person. So at Tufts, I had permission from the president to experiment. Larry used to say to me as an economist, this application is an example of intensity of preference. It takes a bit more work to fill it out, but when a student has done that, they're serious about this place. And I think the danger in contemporary college admission is it's too easy to apply to some places. You fill out the common application, you click submit, sometimes without a supplement, sometimes without testing, sometimes without an application fee, sometimes without an interview. And I don't think you have enough info to be able to meet someone in their multiplicity of being and say, yeah, I see you here.
But Lee, if we don't make it really easy to click submit, then how are we going to juice our application numbers when we
Yeah.
have to report them?
So I'm I've been saying to people, if my career were a baseball game, I'm in the top of the ninth just by virtue of how long I've been doing this. So in the top of the ninth, I feel free to say the following: volume is not the coin of the realm. I think we've allowed ourselves to chase volume, to point to big pools,
Yeah.
and say that pool and its size is some marker of quality and success. I don't think it is. I think it's easy for students to over apply. I heard a story in the news this spring of a student who got into 65 colleges.
Dear Lord.
Yeah,
Wow.
and I yelled at the news when I saw that. I thought you do,
Don't celebrate this.
no, but I work at a place with almost 29,000 applications for a class of 1,175. I don't need 35,000.
Right.
And if we had 25,000 or 20,000, that would also be plenty of people to fill a class of my size. So the scale that we manage triggers this economics 101 issue, which is supply and demand. And I end up managing scarcity
Yeah.
as well as managing individual applications and shaping a community because we have overwhelming demand for the supply of seats in the class. So, for a place like Tufts and now Dartmouth, where I've brought my little narrative toolkit, I have stubbornly continued to ask students to do a little more work and to fill out a supplement that has some questions on it. At Dartmouth, we have a peer recommendation because we're building a community in a rural part of northern New England that needs to be self-sufficient, and that peer-to-peer dynamic is really important. We still have an alumni interview as an optional but recommended element because I think the way you communicate in person is valuable. And, that set of qualitative information helps me navigate a 6% acceptance rate, because as I say to my colleagues as we're reading, you're looking for reasons to say yes. That's our goal as admission people. But the byproduct of our scarcity is we also have to say no. And when you're saying no to someone with straight A's and nice scores, you need to have a thoughtful rationale for why that high achiever didn't join the class.
Mm-hmm.
And so more story is valuable. And, to Volt's question about, what some of the questions we had at Tufts, we were experimenting with what were then known as the non-cognitive factors. How do you value and assess things like creativity and analytical reasoning, wisdom, collaboration? And it was, the Dean of Arts and Sciences at that point was the psychologist Robert Sternberg, and those qualities were part of his research on intelligence assessment. And I remember him saying to me, if you value creativity, and we should, have you asked a question on the application that invites a creative response? Mm-hmm. If you value an analytical skill, are any of the questions analytical in the way you've invited someone to respond? And as readers, are you assessing those qualities in the full file? And we were, but in a much fuzzier way than Bob introduced to me as the dean in the 2010s. And I have continued to value that perspective, to say voice is powerful. And if you value something, you need to ask for it.
So we've been talking, Lee, and it's been fascinating about the sensibility, the philosophy that you bring to looking at those applications. And you said, we're looking for a reason to say yes here. Mm-hmm. I want to turn this on its ear for just a little bit, because when you got to Tufts, Tufts was a nice school. It was a good school. I don't think it's hyperbole for me to say, you made it a hot school. I mean, it was like everyone wanted to apply. I remember being on campus and you're like, one of the Obama daughters is coming to check us out. So, so on one side, you're talking about looking for ways to say yes to these really wonderful applicants. Talk to us about what it's like to transform the reputation of a good school into the school everyone is applying to and dying to get into.
You know, that's a kind characterization, so thank you. And um, the Obama visit was one of those moments of my career where I'm like, wow, just got vetted by the Secret Service. um, uh, and he whispered to me as they were leaving, I hope she doesn't come. And I said, why? And he said, it's hard to have a presidential daughter on your campus. So that was, um, you know, if part of my responsibility is to be the steward of the college's reputation. And you steward that reputation through narrative, like how do you introduce this college to the next wave of applicants? You steward it through the decisions that are made school by school, because when you're in a really selective space, high schools and the people in them and the parents who are part of those communities, they notice who got in, who didn't. And paying attention to that kind of reputation is, I think, part of my job. And I also think what starts to feed itself in the Tufts example, and I think Dartmouth had a similar story over the last decade. When you enroll people who are excited to be there, you know, when you tell the story well, when you get applicants who are clearly singing the same song, and when you admit and they enroll and they're happy, it ripples. And you know, the happy factor shows, you know, people sense it when they come to visit campus, and they can pick up a vibe. I mean, high school seniors tell me all the time that vibe is this really important dimension of a search, and you can't quantify vibe, but every Gen Zer I talk to says, oh yeah, vibe. And they know it when they feel it. And so I think part of the story at Tufts and part of the story at Dartmouth has been to just understand the vibe and to not try and be something we're not. You know, when I was new at Dartmouth in 2016, I was listening to an info session, and the admission officer was talking about this as an urban experience because our schedule allowed students to have terms somewhere besides Hanover, New Hampshire. And I went afterwards, I said, time out. You have to talk about this as a rural experience. And he said, no, the high achieving students want urban. I said, well, guess what? That's not who we are. We are.
They'll be shocked they step into Hanover thinking it's urban.
It's happening. We were talking about Dartmouth in I called it the faux urban story. And I said, no, get it back. And we had a consultant group look at us and say, you got to tell an urban story because that's what high achieving students want. And I rejected that study and said, no, we have to be true to this place where it is. And we started talking about the idea of a profound sense of place informs a profound sense of purpose. And speaking about Dartmouth College through the prism of a liberal arts college located in a small town in the North Woods of New Hampshire, bordered by the mountains and the river, gave us a narrative that resonated with the people who would thrive in this kind of community. And others said, that's not what I want. I was like, good. And, you know, I met a student my first year. He said, you know, how far are you from a city? I said, well, we're 2 hours from Boston and we're about 3-ish hours from Montreal. And he looked at me and said, oh my God. And I said, that's not what you're looking for? And he said, no. I said, Good.
Okay.
I'm glad you discovered that because that's who we are, where we are, what we do. Um, but what you hear me saying is you have to be confident without being cocky in owning your place. And, when I was at Trinity as an undergrad, it was the opposite. It was a liberal arts college in the capital city of Connecticut, and it was urban in a way that Williams and Middlebury and Bates were not. And Trinity was struggling then to be urban. And my boss at Tufts ended up going there as the president in, it was like 2015-ish. And I said to her, here's the secret sauce. You have to celebrate Trinity as a liberal arts college with an urban pulse. And she did that. And, it's kind of the opposite of the Dartmouth story where it's like you can't pretend Trinity College is not in Hartford, is not in a city, that there aren't, and the assets of that, there's the museums and the newspaper and the insurance industry, and make that work. And I think campuses that do that are ones that thrive, where they figure out their secret sauce. Without using the word unique, I hear so many admission tour guides and mission officers when I'm amongst them talk about another unique thing about our college. And it's like, is it really unique, or is there a local flavor that you want to be clear about, but probably a shared quality across a peer group?
I love it.
You love it.
And
I don't like
I,
the new word.
I will just, and this will probably get cut from the podcast, but I will always and forever remember our conversations about Ludlow suits and double monk strap
Yeah,
shoes.
yeah.
And I don't know, there's this sense of coolness that you just engendered at Tufts. That was to me like, oh my God, and this was when J. Crew was like
Yeah,
really, really,
well,
really, really hot. I'm like, this is the J. Crew of universities. I
I'm
want to be
I'm
here.
the J. Crew team. But Voltaire, that what's so funny about you remembering that is I've, you know, showed up at work one day on a vacation day, and I was wearing like cut-off jeans and Birkenstocks, and I was unshaven. And someone said, "Where's the preppy guy?" I said, "I'm still that." I said, "You see me at work in my dean outfit. Like, when I was at Conn College in the 90s, I was 32 when I became a dean, and I had to dress older than I was to look the part." Because I would go into an information session and introduce myself, and I was younger than the parents. I was. I mean, and my funny story from my very first faculty meeting at Connecticut College is I did the talk, and at the reception afterwards, the chair of the government department came up to me. He goes, "I'm not going to lie, President introduced you," and I looked at my neighbor. I said, "Roger, who's this little shit they just put in charge of admission?" He said, "Because you were so young, but." He said, "You knew what you were talking about, and I was glad you were in the role." But he said, "You're like a puppy." And so, when you're talking about my Ludlow suits, I learned that I had to comport myself in a way that was both professional, but also I tried to be hip. I didn't want to be stuffy, and I was trying to represent the campus where I worked. And,
You
so
rocked it,
I
and I
rocked
am
it.
curious, did you ever, ever, ever wear the short pants version of the Ludlow suit?
You
Because
know,
we talked about you're buying
I
it.
did buy it. I still own it, and I have never had the chutzpah to actually wear that suit in public, but I own it.
We're gonna
But
need time and
fashion
patience.
matters. I don't think you should cut this because it's it's um it's part of storytelling. It's part of and someone asked me once that I was dressed accordingly, I had a bow tie on, and somebody made an assumption about me based on how I was dressed. And I said, "Well, what's connect all these dots?" And the person said, "You're like a white man of privilege who dot dot dot." I said, "Actually, I was first gen college. I had a Pell Grant. I was a financial aid recipient, worked at McDonald's, and I said, in the contemporary vernacular, I would have been an access kid. And they went, "Oh." And I said, so you're misreading my wrapping paper, uh, that belies my origin story, which, um,
Lee Coffin, master of the vibes. That put it on your LinkedIn
not
headline.
sort of it's because the kids notice it, and the thing that I'm very aware of in the role I'm in at Dartmouth is you twin the idea of being the dean with being an Ivy dean, and it's intimidating. And the first time I did high school visits as Dartmouth's dean, this boy said to me at the end of the info session, he goes, "You're a surprise." And I said, "Well, that's cheeky. Why do you think? Why was I a surprise?" And he said, "Well, you're fun and you seem like a good guy." And this is a high school senior, and I said, "Thank you." And I said, "Why wouldn't I have been either of those things?" He said, "Well, you're an Ivy Dean. You're like all villains." And I said, "Yeah." And I said, "But, we're not cartoon characters who just say no." And part of, I have a podcast that's been going for 10 seasons. We're about to do our 10th season. And part of the impulse of doing the pod was to break that stereotype, to be, it's called Admission Beat, and Ivy Dean demystifies college admissions. And it was the same idea. How do I use the seat that I've got to tell a story about college admission that is reassuring, not intimidating? How do I break down this wall? How do I take the cartoon character called Ivy Dean and not make the person sinister and just kind of an agent of doom? And, there are people listening who might say, "You are an agent of doom. You said no to 94% of the people who applied." And I said, "But my purpose was to say yes. I can't say yes to everyone, but that's the purpose. I am the dean of admission because the job is to say yes. And when we've said yes to enough people that fills the class, we can't say yes anymore. But that's not a rejection of the next person in line. It's just saying we're full." And I don't apologize for selectivity because I think it's just the work I do. I can't say yes to everyone. This weekend I was at a reunion of my high school drama club, and it was the 50th anniversary of the director's first show, and I went back, and it was wonderful. But he was talking about casting, and he said, over the years I had to disappoint a lot of people who thought they deserved a part, or they thought they were next in line to get the lead, and they didn't get it. And I realized, I have that same phenomenon. I'm casting a class, and everybody who auditions can't be cast. And it was sort of this interesting juxtaposition of theater and college admission, where it's yeah, you've got roles, you've submitted an audition, aka the application, we read it, and we have to make informed decisions. I'm way off tangent, aren't I?
No, no,
But we
no.
love it. That's where the best part comes from. And for the record, none of this is getting cut. So.
And as we were
And the
talking,
2-hour podcast this week.
Yes.
your word villain actually leads right into Mallory's question about SATs.
Oh, okay.
Perfect segue. And you brought up this point around data and voice, and we've
Yep.
been talking a lot about the voice side of things, but
Yeah.
of course there is the data side of
Yeah.
things too, because our institutions do run on data, and sometimes that's rankings and yield rates, etc., and sometimes that's SAT scores. And so in 2024, you made Dartmouth the very first Ivy to bring back the SAT requirement, and you argued that the test was going to widen access, not shrink it. And that's a really hard argument to make, in our current climate. You said, and had data to back you, and other Ivies kind of followed suit within about a year. And so I wanted take you there, right? Like you built this whole
Trendsetter.
career on voice. Master of vibes,
Yeah.
Lee Coffin built his career on voice. But then you made one of your most famous calls on the most standardized number that we've got. So, like, how do we hold both at the same time?
Yeah, I can be two things at the same time.
Mm.
I used to, my joke from way back, I said, I'm a gay Catholic. I haven't left the church. Like, I stayed in the pew, and it's like I'm able to kind of see two sides of the same coin. And I think the SAT, ACT piece is a piece. It is not the whole. And when um, we became test optional in June 2020 when the pandemic was roaring, and the College Board, uh, right around this week, 6 years ago, College Board wrote to all the deans and said, we cannot guarantee our test centers. They're closing. We can't, when we do have a site, we don't control, we can't guarantee public health, and please be flexible with this part of your application. And I called the provost that morning and I said, Joe, I think we have to be optional. I don't know how we require something that can't be universally attained. And so we suspended the required testing, and I use that word deliberately. We never intended to remain test optional. It was always a pause until the pandemic was over. And as we moved into the third year of pandemic test policy, we started to ask the question, should we bring it back? When will we bring it back? And a faculty study looked at it and said to us, there's value here. And to the idea that, reinstating testing somehow contradicts my commitment to voice, I would say, no, data, voice. They're there together. They're siblings. And what we were finding in not the first year of test optional, because nobody had it. Those were really hard decisions to make, though, because you're like, wow, everybody's got passes called A's, and we don't have an SAT anymore to help us sort. And for me, the fundamental question on every file is this person positioned to thrive? And if the answer to that question is no, it doesn't matter what the voice is. This is not the right place. So having, data that said the scores in context, and I think the most, if I can reclaim my icon status on this one, he started talking about 2 years ago was not here's the average SAT to enter Dartmouth College. What we said was, what's the score range at your high school?
Interesting.
And how does your score stack up on that array? What's the mean and what's the 75th percentile? So what's the top 25 of test takers? And there were many kids, I'll use a rural example, rural public high school in Nebraska. And maybe a third of the class took ACT, SAT. And the average score was a 1060. And this student had a 1200. During test optional, that student was withholding the score because the belief was that score was below our profile and therefore not strong, quote unquote. And what we say now is that 1200 is 150 points higher than the class mean at your school. You have tested well and have given us a data point to be able to say, when here, you will navigate this curriculum in a clear and positive way. And that's been interesting to start to redefine the role of a test score in a holistic college admission process.
That's got to be first gen Lee coming
I
out
was first in
because
Lee, yeah.
yeah, because you talked about the admission counselors you hire and you have to have a lot of unique perspectives, right? But something tells me maybe one of your unique perspectives, and I'll say certainly mine, who your Nebraska example is not too unsimilar than my kind of rural upbringing, right? If you've got a kid who's testing 150, 200, 250 points higher than the rest of their classmates, you got to stop and pay attention,
Yes.
even if that number is lower than,
Well,
the
I mean,
average at the
yeah.
school.
And well, and the mean from my whole class doesn't tell you the whole story because
No.
it's, like where are they from? I mean, we have a class of 1,175 students. They come from over 1,000 high schools around the world. So as you start to spin that really heterogeneous group of high achievers and you land in their individual high schools, there are different norms, different environmental factors in all of those places. And so I would argue back that testing in context is story.
Yeah.
It's giving the number some nuance that is helpful. And the other thing that's pushed us back to the testing space is there's a lot of A's in the high school domain right now. And so when you're reading a pool like the one manage, and you've got a bunch of high achievers with straight A's, that's not enough data to answer the question. And testing in context gives you a really elegant way of understanding local. And local could be a state, it could be a town, it could be a school in the town, but you start to see a different way of interpreting data than what the historical norm has been, which is, you report the middle 50%. People score between a X and Y. I don't, that's not how we use it. I'm a friend's child is getting guidance from me on his application. And he said, oh, you have a 1160. And I said, split that apart. What's your verbal? What's your math? Because those tell us different things. And in his case, the math was a little higher. And I said, so that's helpful because that's giving me a way of looking at the courses you're taking and the majors you're thinking about, which have a little bit more quant than words. That makes sense.
Yeah.
So I'm smiling though at the characterization that I'm like I am not the superhero of testing or even the champion, but I did see an opportunity to say something that was not the conventional wisdom.
Yeah.
Did you know it was going to set off a national conversation?
Yes, I suspected it would have because what I've learned about Ivy League admission is when any one of us do something, it generates a headline.
Interesting.
And so what we tried to do at Dartmouth was own the headline. And, not to name drop, but Shonda Rhimes is one of our trustees. And she said to me in the meeting before we announced, she said, here's my best advice about storytelling. Set your story, communicate it in your own words, look forward, don't apologize. So I called that the gospel of Shonda. Like I was
Oh my gosh.
doing that, own it. She said,
I
"You've made-"
subscribe.
Yeah. No, it just don't let yourself get pulled into an apology
Yeah.
for something that feels true to the work you're doing here, and to say to kids of all backgrounds, your scores are good, and trust us to be able to interpret them in your local context. And very few people understand that we do that, and so that bad on us as college admission officers that we haven't found a way to translate that so that guidance counselors and families and kids can look at a score and be like, I did well. I had a journalist say to me listened to this conversation, and she said, "So you're telling me that an 1100 is good and a 1400 could be bad?" And I said, "I think we need to sunset good, bad as descriptors of individual scores out of context. Because a 1400 is a score where everybody's getting 1500, that's a fine score. It's just not as shiny out of that particular place. But a 1400 out of a place where everyone's getting 950,
Stellar.
that's stellar, and but lower than the mean that we had been posting on our website pre-pandemic. And you had students, kind of to the question about um, inviting access, we had people misinterpreting their scores and saying, "I'm not strong enough to apply." And we're like, "You were." Anyway.
Well, you had said just a second ago that it was on you as admissions counselors for not getting some of this story out or for making clear. But the point of fact is that you have. I mean, you are about to start your 32nd year as a dean of admissions, and for the last 5 years, you have been producing your own podcast about demystifying admissions. So you are doing, quote unquote, your act of admission citizenship. And I'm curious, Lee, where is the biggest gap between what institutions think they're saying, communicating well, and what prospective families are actually hearing?
Yeah. So parents will probably understand this more than kids who might listen, but the Charlie Brown cartoons of old, whenever an adult's book goes wah 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 wah, and the kids had words and the adults were always like wah 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 wah, and I think a lot of admission officers and financial aid officers sound like wah 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 when we get into higher ed speak, and forget that families listening to the story we're telling may not understand things like net price or the expected family contribution or holistic admission, etc. And I think the language we use sometimes sounds like gibberish. And again, back to your very first question, my first gen identity keeps asking, how do I translate the admission process, the financial aid process, and all of its component parts into digestible information that is reassuring, not inflaming. I had a dad say to me this spring, your pod has really helped me understand college admission. He goes, it's been sobering sometimes to understand the volume proposition and the way it works. He said, but I own it in a way I didn't before. I said, great, thank you. And, so what I'm trying to do, back to your question about do they anticipate testing, we get the headline. Yeah. And can I use this role while I have it to be more of an explainer and pull the curtain back a little bit and not be afraid to let Dorothy see the wizard as a guy? Don't wait for Toto to do it. How do I share what I know and to do it as transparently and clearly as I can, knowing that there's things that are nuanced and complicated and sometimes confidential, and I can't spill all the tea. But how do I day by day, and especially on the podcast, bring guests who are welcoming, funny when we can be funny, reassuring, and back to that kid who said to me, you're much nicer than I thought you'd be. I hear that from the pod listeners. They say it's been this one mom said to me, every time you giggle, I like you more.
Oh.
Yeah, and I said, well, my giggle. She had this really lovely giggle that I wasn't really aware of. See, I just had a giggle
There
there.
it is.
But she said, it's just disarming. She said, it's a reminder that the people doing your job are our neighbors. I said, right. And I said, we are doing our job in places where we have to make decisions. I said, the thing that usually gets parents to understand college admission is when I ask them, have you ever had to hire someone? And many of them will say yes. And I said, so, you had some resumes and you read them and you interviewed a subset and then you chose someone. And they say yes. I said, was the runner-up unqualified? And they say no. I said, that's what I do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, volume's different. And it's more emotional. I mean, college admission has a romantic vibe to it that invites feelings, and that's important. But that's also why there's so much heat around it too. I think people look at college and see um, ambition, like there's a lottery ticket here that I have to win it. And you should go to the place where you're the best fit. But I think helping people remember that there are so many wonderful options in the United States and around the world. And, one place is unlikely to be the only place where you can do well.
Yeah. Lee, as we start to wind this interview down, you mentioned that you're in your ninth inning, and
Yeah.
before the baseball game wraps up,
Yeah.
there's a lot happening. There's international students who are in visa limbo. There's a federal government with its hand on admissions. There's the whole AI crisis. I'm sure that is impacting the application process in its own unique ways. So, out of everything on your desk, before that last pitch gets thrown, what is the one thing that you want to get right?
Wow. So you end with a tiny question. There's a lot going on, but I would also say over the 31 years that I've completed, there's a lot going on almost every year, and the what changes, the fundamentals of the work we do have largely remained intact. Volume's gone up, but the app is still the app. Essays are still the essays, hopefully written by a student, maybe helped by AI. My closing chapter is that when I get to it is I hope to hand the baton to the next generation of admission leaders and say, hold true to the values we've had for the last 50 plus years, like meet people as individuals, build communities out of multiple parts that celebrate storytelling. The political environment shifts, courts change rules, you adapt as you need to, and doing that compliance doesn't mean you surrender the values that animate the work. And that's what I've tried to do. And someone asked me yesterday about, how could you possibly do your job after the Supreme Court? And I said, I do it. I do not get to tell the Supreme Court how to make a decision. They made one, and I have to be compliant. And that doesn't mean students from diverse backgrounds have stopped telling their story. And helping people from all walks of life tell their story is important and powerful. And so, I would say that anybody listening, own your story. And if that is my closing inning, I'll be happy that I have ended my tenure. I'm just listeners. It's not today. But I that I will complete my tenure the way I began it. The things I do today are the toolkits I was taught in the early '90s by my predecessors, and they were valuable. They've served me well. I've taught other people how to do what I've done, and that's how you pay it forward. You create a legacy through the colleagues who continue, and the students who we have the privilege of knowing. But I can't get worried about. I mean, that you're right. There's a lot of headlines. There's a lot of topics, and I would be immobilized if I let them get in my head too much.
This was fantastic. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. Oh my God, Mallory, was he killing you softly with his thumb? Was he strumming your fate with his fingers?
I mean, Voltaire, the whole time, I can't take it seriously with that quote.
Was he singing your life with his words?
The whole time we were talking to Lee, I was like, oh my gosh, I was also basically a first gen kid in a rural area who had a guidance counselor who, like, at the end of the day, really didn't support my college process because I was the smart kid in the room and I was interviewing for admission roles. I felt like I had to be the voice of, like, that kid in the room, and just as I was like, wait, Lee, are we the same person?
The experiences that we have shape our life view. They shape our philosophy, and they also make us, depending on the way that we're wired, they make us want to build a better future for other people.
I think that's it. And that's why I love this industry so much. I feel like at the end of the day, maybe the impact I can have is to help that kid find their right fit place. Yeah. And, you know, I love how Lee talked about that he's in the job of saying yes.
Yeah.
Right? He's the warmest gatekeeper in the Ivy League.
Yeah. I mean, over and over again in my mind as he was talking, I was just reflecting about the deep sense of humanity and kindness that he brings to this. And I know it's not the same throughout the industry. Lee is a very, very special person, incredibly well-wired for this sort of work. But the way that he approaches things, the way he talks about finding the story in the data and looking at both data and voice and saying that even testing in context tells you a different story. Even the way that he hires people to have a diversity of opinions so that they can represent the people whose applications they're getting. That's just amazing, and I'm not going to cry this episode. I am not going to cry. But, you know, it's so cool to know that he shapes his team so deliberately in order to make the best possible decisions. And that shows up in the work that he's done with Tufts and with Dartmouth. I mean, I wasn't kidding when I said that he took a school that everyone knew was a good school, and he made it freaking hot. I mean, everyone...
Yeah.
I mean, I wanted to go back to college when I stepped foot on campus. It was so cool. I've always been in quiet awe over Lee's his work, his sensibilities, his brilliance.
Lee took, speaking of his brilliance, he took the most cold-blooded number in the room, the test score, and he convinced me why it matters in the last 10 minutes of our conversation with him, right? He turned that number into a story, and just the way that he approached it, the story about the Nebraska town where you know, the 1200 is 150 points ahead of the average, and what that means, and the fact that he is finding the context in the number, and look, like, this field has been at war over test optional for 15 plus years. I feel like he just walked in and dissolved the fight in a single podcast.
It's amazing. Well, and the way that he did that for students and talking about the SAT score and the admissions process, I think he did the exact same thing talking about institutions. When he was talking about Dartmouth and how a consultant said, you have to market yourself as an urban experience because that's what people want. And I'm like, I've been to Hanover. There is no way.
The only gelato that was worth its salt closed 10 years ago, okay? Like...
I mean, the plaid alone, Mallory, the plaid.
I lived about 25 minutes away from Hanover as a single 25-year-old. This is a challenging place for the youth, okay?
And I loved how he said you own it. And what was his quote? A profound sense of place informs a profound sense of purpose.
Yes. Yes. And his stories about how the wrong fit students opt out, like, and how he celebrates that.
Yeah,
Good.
absolutely.
Good.
Finding the happy factor, finding the vibe, being true to yourself. And I think that his final piece of advice, which came from Shonda, okay, I get it, but own your story. Mm-hmm. I love that.
Yeah. Master of the vibes. Who knew? Lee Coffin.
Can we call him Vibe Master? Kind of like
Vibe Master. I really appreciated the transparency that he brought to the conversation, that I think he's brought to his role at the various institutions that he's been at. I always put a stake down saying, like, it is always better to be transparent. It's just always served me well in life, in my career. I feel like a little validated from Lee in that, and like the demystification of what is one of the most mystifying things, like how many movies and books and like pop culture loves to embrace the mystery that is getting into the Ivy League, right? Yeah. And he has a whole podcast to like debunk it. His whole personality is like, no, like I was the first gen student who was very confused in this process, and I feel like he's just made it his life mission to go help fix that for everybody else.
Yeah, he's been an incredibly singular voice in admissions, and I'm so glad we had the chance to talk with him. So glad we got to hear his story, and so glad, I don't know about you, but I learned an awful lot, not only about how admissions works, but how to be true to yourself as an institution and as an individual. And again, it just comes back to this idea for me of honesty, humanity, and connection.
Yeah. Wow. We are so lucky, Voltaire. We thank you for letting us be in your earbuds.
Yeah, absolutely. Everyone, I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as Mallory and I enjoyed recording it. And we will talk soon. Mallory, what should everyone be?
Iconic. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Higher Ed Icons celebrates the pioneers, thought leaders, and changemakers who have shaped and continue to shape higher education marketing.
New episodes drop every other Tuesday. Subscribe and leave us a rating wherever you listen.
Higher Ed Icons is made possible by our founding sponsor, On Deck Marketing, keeping colleges and universities visible where students learn, walk, and scroll.
Learn more at ondeckmarketing.com. That's ondeckmktg.com to learn more.